With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Chaf. We left off on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, 2 lines from the top of the Amid. We're going to first begin with a story that illustrates that when a person makes a commitment, bitnai, on condition, with a stipulation, the order, the seder of his wordings is going to be tantamount. It's going to be really essential. As we are learning our sugya, kishitas Rashi and like shitas Tosfos, we're going to go back to the machlokas on Daf Yutes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and focus on their argument regarding smicha, connected to the sugya of tekev l'smicha shchita, that normally we learn that shchita has to immediately follow the leaning. And Beis Shammai, who says that you don't do smicha on Yom Tov, and we learned on Daf Yutes Amud Aleph in the bottom on Abraisa, you do the smicha prior to Yom Tov. We're going to see whether this relates to their machloikas concerning this principle of tekev l'smicha shchita. We're going to learn stories about Hillel's attitude of pursuing peace versus confrontation, and that was so important. The midah of shalom was so important that Hillel was the one that was mishane Mipnei Hasholem. Mishana means not that he lied, but he deviated. He wasn't fully emes la'amitoi, not because he didn't value the midah of emes, but because he valued the midah of shalom even more than emes. We're going to also learn how Talmidim of Hillel, they to stand up for their Rebbe, to stand up for Hillel, they did sometimes confront Talmidei Beis Shammai. Until today, that's the meaning of many Hasidim, that even when the Rebbes, they try to get along, the Hasidim, they really they have a much higher level of confrontation. And when a person has to criticize another, there's a Zamida that we're going to learn, that your response should never be greater than the words of criticism. It should be the same. If you were criticized with 3 words and you feel you have to confront and respond only with 3 words and not more. And after that, on Daf Chaf Amud Beis, we're going to come back to the discussion that we had in the beginning on Daf Yutes, the whole Daf Yutes Amud Beis, as far to this question, what is Shitas Beis Hillel, whether Beis Hillel allows for you to bring shlamim that are in the category of neder and nadava on Yom Tiv. In other words, or Beis Hillel is only allowing for you to bring karbanos Yom Tov related shlamim on Yom Tov. But if it's not related to Yom Tov, then even Beis Hillel will hold that you may not bring it. And according to that opinion, what will happen if someone did bring a shlamim that was a neder and a nadava? They brought it, they shechted it. Now what? In other words, the question is, do you now bring the blood? Are you zoydek the dam? Or are you not zoydek the dam? Well, if you're zoydek the dam, you'll be able to put on the emurim. If you put on the emurim, then you'll be able to eat it, or not, and much, much more. So we are on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph. We are 2 lines from the top of the Amud by the 2 dots. Really, we're learning a story. This is not an agadata. This is going to be a story that's going to illustrate that even when, if you would have ordered the stipulation, it would have been effective, but the seder is tantamount. And it's a phenomenal story. Hahu Gavra. There was a person, the Amar Lahu, that said, Havulei arba meya zuzah leploni, give 400 golden coins to Chaim Yankel. Now he wants for so-and-so Chaim Yankel to marry his daughter. Really, he wants to say that if he'll marry my daughter, I'll give him 400 zuz. He didn't word it that way. He said, give him 400 zuz. And then, Vilnesiv Berati, and he should marry my daughter. Now, as we spoke out at the end of the last year, normally when you make a statement, you have a small amount of time, which we call that toich kedei dibur, within the time that it takes for you to say either Shalom Alecha Rebbe or Shalom Alecha Rebbe Umoidi Machlekes. You can clarify what you meant. You can even retract that which you said. Now here, we're not speaking about kachim. Here we're speaking about a financial commitment. When it comes to financial commitments, you normally have that time frame, but we have to clarify that this Gavra was a shchiv merah, says Rashi. That means he was dying. And there's a rule that when someone is in the process of dying, the sages said that his words are tantamount to making a kinyan. So that's why here, like in the case above, he said, give to so-and-so 400 zuz. That statement is final. Now he adds, and let him marry my daughter. Too late. Too late. The Seder was wrong. Amar Rav Papa, based on what we learned above, Arba Meya Shakel. That Chaim Yankel who are calling him, he gets the 400 zuz. Uberate, what about the daughter? It's up to him. Iboye Nasiv, if he wants, he can marry her. Iboye Loy Nasiv. Lerashi, Ula Toisvis. And that's the Hemshech. Tama the Amr, that's the right that Toisvis brings, that we learned the Toisvis at the end of last year. Tama the Amr Havali, the only reason why it's not binding, in other words, we don't say that if you don't marry the daughter, you don't get the money, is because first he said Havali, give him the money. Then he said Ulin Nesiv, or Vilin Nesiv. Aval, however, if he would have changed the Seder, Aval Amar Vilin Nesiv, if he would have says, let him marry my daughter and give him, then we would make it connected. Then we would say, in Nasiv Shakel, Ilay Nasiv, Loy Shakel. Seder order is extremely important.
Rabbi, are we talking about like a Bita Shekana here, or
no?
Like where it says that he's marrying her off? Or
No. It's a person who is a dying man who wants to make sure that so and so, if so and so will marry his daughter, he's giving a dowry. But you have to be careful how you order things. Okay, now let's go back for a second. The concept, the rule that we learned at the end of the last year, that if you have an obligation to do something, you can't use money that anyways is already a obligation money and double dip. Which is why we said that if a person, when he separates an animal and he says, this is going to be a carbon toida, if I can also use it, right? It doesn't work because of the order. That was a question that was asked from Rish Lakish. That was the answer that was given by Rabbi Yechanan. However, Yosef Mereimar, the Ka'amar Laha Shmaitza, Mishmeidan Afshei, that he didn't have a version of a question and an answer. He just made a statement that if a person says, Harei Olai Toida, Ve'eit Seba Yedei Chagiga, if you make such a statement, so then the person has to bring a carbon toida, but he may not use it for his obligation of chagiga. But he didn't quote anyone, and there was no question and answer. So Amalei Ravina Lemareimar, Aton Hachimas Nisula, very nice. You're saying your own din. But Anan, our version was but we had it as a question and an answer. Now guys, this goes beyond, not only is Oimer Davar B'Shem Oimroi, I think there's much more to this. Much more to this is that the correct way of learning is questions and answers. If you don't, the question is gold. Question means that you're curious. The question means that it's bothering you. So you're going to be open to the answer, or you'll challenge the answer, you'll remember the answer. So it's much better to have a version where there was a question, where there was an answer, than stam to learn it straight. Someone once told me when we were younger in yeshiva that the problem we have is that we have all the answers before the questions. When we went on Mivtzoim, we don't even appreciate it. Masha'engen, a person who questions, and then when they hear the things that we take for granted, they appreciate it better. They remember it better. They understand what the answer is answering. Okay. However, we're coming back here to the machlokes we had on Daf Yutes Amud Aleph between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel regarding the mitzvah of doing smicha. Smicha means to lean. Smicha in this context is that when you bring almost all of the karbanos, the owner would lean with his hands on the head of the animal with all of his might. Either he would say words of confession or he would say words of praise. And it's not essential, but it's one of the mitzvahs that come together with karbanos. Beis Shammai says that you don't do smicha. And Yom Tov Beis Hillel says that if you bring the karban, you do smicha. Says, think about it. Tanach Kamei Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. Again, you had these Amoraim. They know all the Tanas. They know all of the Braisas by heart. So such a Braisa teacher was standing in front of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, and he quoted the following from memory. The following Braisa. This Braisa is based on a pasuk in Parsha Shmini. There, the pasuk says, "Vayakrev es ha'oila vayaseho kamishpat." They were speaking about the obligation oila that Aaron HaKohen needed to bring on Shmini L'Biluim. An oilas choiva. And when it says that he brought it and he did it as its rules, kamishpat oilas lindava, it means that he needed to do it like God wrote out how an oila, a voluntary oila, is brought. In Parshas Vayikra, the Torah says regarding a voluntary oila, v'samach yodoi al roisha oila. Before you bring a carbon oila, you have to lean your hands. The Torah never writes that when you bring an obligatory oila, you have to do smicha as well. This pasuk in Shmini is being used to tell you that yes, even an oilas chayva needs to have smicha prior. Limeid al oilas chayva shetuuna smicha. Which also means, according to this Tana, that if not for this verse, on our own, we wouldn't have known that. Now that's a little bit of a problem, because there is a general way of learning Torah Shebal Peh, and that's called a binyanav. Okay, the Torah doesn't have to write everything everywhere. The Torah wrote by Oilas Nadava du Smicha. One can argue, okay, so if you see that there's smicha by an oila, do a smicha by the oila. Nadava, choiva is not that important. No. This Tana needs to have a limit. So Amar Lei, Rabbi Yitzchak told this Tana teacher, to Amar Lach, you know who must have been authored, you know who authored this Beitzah? Those who follow the sheet of Beis Shammai. What's Beis Shammai have to do with this? So added Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, Deloi Gomri Shalmei Choiva Mishalmei Nedava. Gevaldik. That we see from our Mishnah, Beis Shammai holds that even though a shlamim that's obligatory, a communal shlamim, is brought on Yom Tov. But let's go further. Shlamim that even the shlamim that is brought on Yom Tov, Beis Shammai says you don't do smicha. That's what Beis Shammai says. Why don't you do smicha? You should know, Chavre, that by Shalmei Choiva, by Shalmei Nedava, the Torah also says you do smicha. So we quoted before a verse in Vayikra concerning a Nedava oila, the Samach Yadai. The Torah also speaks about a Shalmei Nedava that you do smicha. If Beis Shammai would have held that since the Torah speaks about smicha by shlamim, even though it's Nedava, automatically you make a binyan av and you learn it to Nedava, if there would be an obligation, a biblical obligation to do smicha by a shalmei chayva, then Beis Shammai would hold when you bring a shlamim on Yom Tov, shalmei chayva, then you have to make smicha. The fact that Beis Shammai says you don't do smicha in the Mishnah is because Beis Shammai does not subscribe to a binyanav. So therefore, just like he doesn't learn Shalmei Choiva from Shalmei Nedava, makes sense that you can't learn Oila Choiva from Oila Nedava, which is why you need to have the pasuk Vayakrev es Oila Vayseok HaMishpat. Because if we would follow Beis Hillel, so understood Rabbi Yitzchak in our Mishnah, Kiven the Gamri Shalmei Choiva and Shalmei Nedava, which is why Rabbi Yitzchak understands Beis Hillel holds you do smicha on Yom Tov. There is an isur to do smicha. You can't make use of an animal on Yom Tov. Why do you do smicha? Obviously because Beis Hillel holds that you have a binyanav. The Torah says when you bring a Shalmei Nedava, make smicha. Must be that when you bring any shlamim, even a chayva, you make smicha, even on Yom Tov. So according to Beis Hillel, we would do the same thing. Oilas chayva nami, according to Beis Hillel, loiti ba'yikra, because we would use the binyan av to learn it from Oilas Nedava. So the Beitzah that you are teaching only follows Beis Shammai. Questions the Gemara against Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. Umimai de Beis Hillel shalmei chayva mishalmei Nedava gamri. Which is why you're saying, and therefore Beis Hillel will also automatically know Oilas Chayva from Oilas Nedava. No, maybe Ma Oilas Chayva Gamri. What we compare is not Shlamim. What we compare is Chayva. How Taka Beis Hillel says in our Mishnah that the Shlamim that you bring on Yom Tov needs smicha on Yom Tov. You know how he knows it? Because he makes a binyan av from Oilas Chayva. Chayva can be learned binyanav, but how does Beis Hillel himself know that an oilas chayva demands smicha? Maybe he needs to have this pasuk. In other words, what is more compatible, oila shlamim, or neder chayva? Yachap, and beautiful. So that's it. So therefore, maybe the author is also Beis Hillel. So counters the Gemara, Maishna mishalmei nedava deloy gamri. You're telling me that Beis Hillel cannot just have a binyanav shlamim chayva from shlamim nedava. And the Torah writes by a shalmei nedava smicha. Why? Because shekein mitzuyin, interesting concept, that anything that is more common might need smicha, but doesn't mean that things that are less common also need smicha. It's the commonality. It's how much, how often. If you can't, if that's enough to take away the binyanav, I'll argue, how would Beis Hillel be able to learn it just from choivas oila when it's also different? Because oila is completely burnt. Shlamim is not completely burnt. So the Gemara says, no. Beis Hillel learns it mi beinayo. Beis Hillel learns that you have to do smicha on shal mei choiva, both from oilas choiva and from shal mei nedava. But how does Beis Hillel know that a oilas choiva needs to have smicha? He also will need to have the pasuk, so therefore the Beitzah goes l'kula alma. L'koda. Okay, so now the Gemara says, which is again the way it sounds like when you read in the Mishnah that on Yontiv you're not going to do smicha. 1 second. Now let me just say it like this. No one thinks that the Shammai holds that you don't do smicha on Shalmei Choiva. No. But are you required or is it better? That's the big difference. If you are required to do smicha, then you'll have to do it on Yontiv. The moment your carbon is brought on Yontiv, you do smicha on Yontiv. The word is that Rabbi Yitzchak says that Beis Shammai holds you're not required. It's a mitzvah to do it. But since you're not required, now that it's Yom Tiv, and B'chlal on Yom Tiv there is a prohibition of making use of an animal, that's why you don't do it. So the Savra Beis Shammai that it's not an obligation, Shalmei Choiva is not required, V'hatanya, Amar Rabbi Yosi, again coming back to our Mishnah Daf Yutes, Lo nechleku Beis Shammai u Beis Hillel al hasmicha atzma, that yes, shetzarich. Al menechleku. Now the question is, how will Beis Shammai learn it? If Beis Shammai does not subscribe to a binyanav, how does he know that there's a requirement? Al menechleku, only concerning this rule of tekev lasmicha shchita, whether shchita must immediately follow the leaning. That Beis Shammai holds that this is what's not needed, einoi tzarich. You have to do smicha, but do smicha erev yontif. And Beis Hillel oimrim that yes, tzarich. So here we got a problem. If that's the case, if Beis Shammai also holds that you need to have smicha, how does Beis Shammai know that Shalmei Choiva needs smicha? Nowhere does the Torah write that Shalmei Choiva needs smicha. It must be that he also subscribes to a binyanav. Just to make that clear. So the Gemara says, now, it's not going to take away the Beitzah, because even if I'll have a binyanav, well, like we said above, maybe Beis Shammai was unable to learn oilas choiva from oilas nodava. For that you need to have a pasuk. But now that you have a pasuk that is even including oilas choiva, between oilas choiva and shalmei nedava, together, mi beinayo, you can learn shalmei choiva. But Rabbi Yitzchak doesn't say that. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yitzchak follows a clear Tana, the Tanya Amar Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda. They both hold that whenever smicha is a requirement, it must be followed by shchita. Smicha, shchita. Al menechleku, al smicha atzma. That Beis Shammai holds ein tzarich. It's not required. It's a mitzvah, but there's no requirement. Beis Hillel holds that it's required. Mamash what Rabbi Yitzchak says. And therefore, when you do something beyond the letter of the law, good for you as long as you are not breaking another rule. But since on Yom Tov there is the other rule that you can't lean on an animal, you can't be mishtamish b'bal chayim, therefore Beis Shammai holds that you do not do smicha. All right. Bottom line is, my friends, we have a machlokes. Can you bring, let's go to oilas re'iyah. That's clear. Every Yom Tov we are obligated to bring a carbon that's completely burnt on the altar. It's called oilas re'iyah. I'm coming to see and to be seen. God is going to see me and I'm going to experience. That's amazing. And especially Bisman Bayis Rishon, you would see godliness in the Beis HaMikdash. You have to bring a carbon oil. Was that carbon oil brought on Yom Tov or not? Now where's Tzvik over here? Here the oil is not eaten at all. Nevertheless, Beis Hillel said on the Mishnah that you bring oilos. That's for sure. You bring a carbon oil. Beis Shammai holds that you don't bring a carbon oil, even though it's connected to Yom Tov, on Yom Tov. So now we're going to learn a story. What happened in the Beis HaMikdash? In the Beis HaMikdash, this is before the Eruvin's Baskoil, that halacha ki Beis Hillel, there was a long period of time where you had, different rules. And what would happen if in the Azar and the Beis HaMikdash, it was filled with Talmidei Beis Shammai? So listen to what happened. Tana Rabbanan. Ma'aseh b'Hillel HaZaken. Shehevi oy losi la'azorim. It was Yom Tov. Hillel himself comes to the Beis HaMikdash. He comes with a korban oil. Now it's interesting that a korban oil has to be a male. A oil cannot be female. A shlamim can be both genders. We don't care. It can be male, it can be female. Now, in other words, if I see a yid in the Azara that's with a male animal, I don't know whether it's an oila. Could be oila, could be a shlamim. But if it's a female animal, it must be a shlamim. And not only that, lismoich aleh beyantiv, which is heshita. If they would have seen him doing smicha, that in itself would have provoked the Talmidei Beis Shammai to confront Hillel, which they did. But they didn't see the smicha. Even though smicha has to be done right before, they didn't see. What they saw was, he's about to shecht an animal. Chavru olav Talmidei Shammai hazakin. That's not so common. So the Hasidim of one Rebbe, they ganged up on the Rebbe, and Amru Loi, Mativa shel behemozu. Upa, what are you bringing over here? Now, what did we also learn? We learned that Beis Shammai is moide, that the Shalmei Chagiga could be brought on Yom Tov, because you're eating it, that's Oichel Nefesh, Achilas Hedyot. So what the emes was, it was an oila. If Hillel would have said this is an oila, there would have been a confrontation. In order to promote peace, he deviated from the truth. Amar lahem nekevehi. It's interesting that we don't use the word sheker, we use the words mishana. Every male has a certain female part to them. Hostu. Today's Meshuggah world. So it was a shino, it wasn't a pure sheker. And look inside the last Rashi in the Amid. Rashi Zok, the last line, Meiroiv an vusanusai, because of his humility, he wasn't afraid of a confrontation. He was just very humble. Now they were not going to believe him. You know what he did? He began to move the tail, because when you move the tail, you can see the gender of the animal. So when they saw that he's going to show them that it's a female, which would prove a female cannot be an oila, they taka didn't look. So kishkeish lahem bizunav, he began to shake the tail, and when they saw taka that he is saying that it's a shlamim, it's not male, and he's going to show them, and he avoided the confrontation. And you should know, says the Beitzah, happened to be that on that day in the Azara there were so many Talmidei Beis Shammai that they had the upper hand. They weren't paskening dinim, but they could have imposed their halacha that no one can bring an oilas re'iyah. And therefore, they were out. They were out to get Hillel. So and ben Buta Shemai. So this is the beauty. Even though he was mitalmidei Shammai, but he knew that the halacha follows Beis Hillel. He knew because there wasn't yet the baskoil. In order to prevent them of forcing Beis Shammai, even though he was, as we say, mitalmidei Shammai hazakin. So v'shalach daf chaf amid beis vehevi kol tzoin kedar. Kedar is the name of a location, and the best sheep is the sheep that comes from Kedar. He brought the best sheep from Yerushalayim. Vehe'emidam ba'azara, and he brought it into the Azara. By the way, Tab Toisva says there's a rule: a korban that's not consecrated may not be brought into the Azara. So it must mean that he didn't bring it into the Azara, but he brought it into Harabayas. He brought in a tremendous amount of animals. And V'amar, and he said the second line, Kol mi sheroitze lismoich yova v'yismoich. Whoever wants to do smicha. Now smicha, according to Beis Shammai, you never do smicha. In other words, he made sure that everyone should behave like Beis Hillel. And indeed, because of Bava Membuta's action, for Oisa Hayoim, Gavra Yodim Shel Beis Hillel, and V'kava Alachi Kemoisan, After that, no one made an issue of it anymore. So it's an amazing story. So Hillel himself did not confront. From Talmidei Shammai there was Azahi Sapcha. And that's how it worked. And that's the best way to resolve a conflict. You have to get someone from the other side to come over. Now let's go weiter. Shuv Maisa beTalmud Echad from the Talmidei Beis Hillel. And we'll see that Talmidei Beis Hillel, even though you would argue that Talmidim of Beis Hillel, they should follow what their Rebbe does. The Rebbe was Mishanim b'pnei HaShalom. They were not Mishanim b'pnei HaShalom. They were Hasidim. They were standing up for their Rebbe. Shehevi oilas elazara lismeichalav. It's double against Shammai. Oilas re'iyah. Beishamai says you can't. And smicha. Even by Shlamim, Beishamai says you can't. So matzu Talmud echad mitalmidei Beishamai. And he confronted him by saying, Amrullah, mazu smicha. Was tust du? You're violating Beishamai. So instead of him being quiet, Amrullah, mazu shtika. Why are you what's this? You should be quiet. Schweig. That's it. That was his counter. And the way he stood up, and he wasn't epking and bepking and explaining and this. No, be quiet. Is Shiskoi Benazifa. He silenced him with this type of rebuke, and Vahalach loy, and he left him alone. Can Hillel avoid in confrontation? Isn't this the story of all Hasidic groups? The Rebbes are tzaddikim, but the Hasidim, they're not that afraid of a confrontation. Amar Abaye, even the confrontation of the Talmidim wasn't that heavy. The criticism was mazu smicha, 3 words, and the rebuke was mazu shtika, 3 words, not more. Hilka chaytzer min rabbanan. To amar lechavre milsa. If someone told you something and you feel that there's a need to respond, don't use more words than the words that were used against you. And we learned it from here, the Iu Amar Mali Smicha, and all he told him was Mali Shtika. And he wasn't using a greater degree of a counter than the words of criticism themselves. Okay, weiter. So let's recap, Chevra. Everyone is moida that the Shalmei Chagiga could be brought. When Beis Shammai for sure does not allow Nedarim and Nedavis. If they're not related to Yom Tov, you can't bring it. We had in the last daf a machloikas tanoim. What does Beis Hillel hold? Some hold that Beis Hillel holds that even Nedarim and Nedavos can also be brought on Yom Tov, even though they're not related to Yom Tov, because since some of the shlamim is eaten by the owner, there's achilas hedyet. So that's the Torah says that for food-related purposes, there's no restrictions on Yom Tov. Other Tanoim hold that Beis Hillel only allows shlamim that's connected to Yom Tov, but ein nedarim unodavis. There was a machlekes b'shitas Beis Hillel. Now we're going to go and learn braises back and forth between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. There are 2 versions of their back and forth, and from these 2 versions we will see again that there is a machlekes Tanoim what Beis Hillel holds. So Tanya, we learned Amru Lahem Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. This is not a debate in the Beis Hamikdash, which is much more heated because there it's B'Poel Mamish. This is in the Beis Midrash. In other words, Beis Shammai holds Chevre that Oilas Re'iyah cannot be brought. That's what we learned. Everyone holds that. Beis Hillel holds that an Oilas Re'iyah could be brought. So concerning this, Beis Hillel tells Beis Shammai, I don't understand. Uma b'makam she'asa lehedyet. The Makam Shas means Shabbos Kodesh. Shabbos Kodesh, all of the malachas, even on Tzorech Reichel Nefesh, may not be done. Nevertheless, in the Beis Hamikdash, if there is a carbon that is communal, related to a time frame, related to Shabbos or Yom Tov, Bimoy Adoy, even Shabbos, it may be brought. Muter Legavoya. So therefore, argues Beis Hillel, Makim Shemuter Lehedyet, when it comes to a day where you can make food for a Hedyet, You can make food for God. In other words, who cares that the oil is not eaten, not even by the Kohanim? It's eaten kaviyachal by the Mizbeach. It's eaten by God. It should be allowed. No. I'll prove to you from the Nadarim and Nadavos that even though if you would be slaughtering an animal for you to eat, it would be permitted. Yet in the Beis HaMikdash, it may not be brought. Now guys, don't forget, Beis Shammai is saying it to Beis Hillel. According to this version, we'll call this the Tanach, it's clear that Beis Shammai knew that Beis Hillel holds that Nadarim and Nadavos of Shlamim may not be brought on Yom Tov. If not, this counter doesn't make sense. Okay, very good. But since you yourself are moida that even Shlamim, Nadarim and Nadavos may not be brought, so therefore, Oilas Re'iyah, which is Taka Achila, Legavoya, it may not be brought. Amru Lahem Beis Hillel, no. It's true, ich bin moed according to this version that it may not be brought over Yom Tov, even though it's Shlamim, because she'ein kavur lahem zman. Because why bring it on Yom Tov? The whole mitzvah of Oilas Re'iyah is connected to Shkavur Lahem Zman. It has to be brought over Yom Tov. Now guys, just to make it clear, it's not that you can only bring it on the first day, Beseder, but it's connected to Yom Tov. It begins on the first day. Amru Lahem Beis Shammai, no, afzu ein kavur lahem zman. No, you don't have to bring it on Yom Tov itself. The Tanan, like we learn, that mi shaloi chag b'yom harishon shel chag. This is not about the oila. This is about the chagiga. Don't forget, even Beis Shammai holds that a kshalmei chagiga is brought without smicha, but it's brought on Yom Tov. If you didn't, chagig v'oila kol haregel kuloi. Very good. Not only kol haregel kuloi, but if you're speaking about sukkos, as far as Shmini Atzeres is concerned, the Yom Tov ha'achron shel chag you can also bring the chagiga that you should have brought on the first day of sukkos. So therefore, it's not azoy zmanoi kavua. On Beis Hillel, you're right. You can bring it also on Chol HaMoed. You can also bring it on the last days, but still, avzu kavur lahem zman. It's still connected to azman. The Tanan that if avar haregel v'lo chag, if all of Yom Tov went by and you didn't bring it, ein chayv ba'achriyusa, you are no longer responsible for the animal. What does that mean? It means that since it may not be brought, you cannot even make it up, which means there's a limited time frame. That's why you could bring it. But again, according to this version, B'shitas Beis Hillel, but a shlamim of a neder and a nadava, it's not bound to a time frame of Yom Tov. It's not b'chlal connected to Yom Tov. That may not be brought. So take that out of the equation. One second. How can you say again that a oilas re'iyah can be brought? What's your argument? That it's for Hashem. It's Hashem's food. So what? It says, lochem, the whole verse, the source that there is a dispensation to violate malachas, l'tzoyrech oichol nefesh, comes from the pasuk in Boi, concerning the Korban Pesach, where it says, ach asher yei ochel l'chol nefesh, hu levade yei oseh lochem. You can do that for you. For you, l'choyra excludes l'gavaya. So Amru Lahem Beis Hillel, no. It says in Parshas Emor, v'chagoysam oisoi chag lashem. Now the word there, lashem, is extra. The word lashem is not only teaching you that the chagiga can be brought on Yom Tov, but kol dil lashem, even the oil can be brought on Yom Tov. It says lochem. Lochem is coming to tell you that there are certain areas where you may not prepare food on Yom Tov. That's taka to tell you, lochem v'loy l'kutim, lochem v'loy l'klavim. You can't violate a malacha to feed animals, even though if you own an animal, you're obligated to feed your animals before you eat, but you can't violate a malacha. You may not prepare food for non-Jews. And by the way, mikan, many people erroneously think that there is an issue of having a non-Jew for the Seder. It's not true. There's nothing specifically about the Seder, but there is a general theoretical problem having non-Jews on your table on any Yom Tov, but you could have a non-Jew on Shabbos, because on Shabbos you're not preparing food at all. On Yom Tov, since you are preparing food, but that's the lochem, you may not break a malacha to prepare food for a non-Jew. When people have very limited amounts of foods, and they know exactly how many guests they're having, and if there's one more guest, they'll make another potato, that's a problem. Not only Pesach for every Yom Tov. Now this is one version of the back and forth of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and it's clear that even Beis Hillel is moida that shlamim, that are nadarim and nadavos, may not be brought may not be brought over Yom Tov. However, Abba Shol has another version of the back and forth, and clearly, La Abba Shol, Beis Hillel holds that Shlamim is allowed to be brought Nedarim and Nedavis on Yom Tov. That what was, so first thing was that this is what Beis Hillel is telling Beis Shammai. On the day where your stove is sealed, it means like another expression of Shabbos. Nevertheless, kiras rabach pesucha, the master's oven is open. That's the bimoy adoy tamid musaf brought on in the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos Kodesh. So b'makom shekiras pesucha on Yom Tov, where your oven is also open, ain't din that the kiras rabach should be pesucha, and you should be allowed to bring an oilas re'iyah on Yom Tov, and v'chein bedin b'chlal it makes sense. Shelo yeh shulchan chamali, but your table will be full, and the table of your Rebbe, referring to God Almighty, will be empty. Doesn't make sense. Now here, we don't have Beis Shammai's objection, Nedarim and Nedavis cannot be brought. They didn't say it in this Abba Shol's version. The Ma'kom Mifligi, clearly that's the machlokes, that Mar Savar going to Abba Shol, that Nedarim and Nedavis are Kerevim B'Yom Tov, according to Beis Hillel. So Beis Shammai could not have told Beis Hillel, you are Moide Shlamim is not brought. Beis Hillel is not. Umar Savar, the Tanach holds, that even the Beis Hillel ain't Kerevim B'Yom Tov. So good. So now we have already the second daf that there is a machlokes Tanoim and therefore Amoyroim. What is the shita of Beis Hillel? Amar Afuna ledivrei ha'omer, that Beis Hillel holds, even Beis Hillel holds that Nedarim and Nedavis, even Shlamim tzvika that you can eat, still ain't Kerevim B'Yom Tov. I want you to know, don't say that this chumrah they view only as a rabbinic chumrah. Like tema that really midairaisa mechzi chazei, but it's only v'rabbanan hu de gazrebu hu gzeira shema yashe. They only said that you may not bring shlamim davis on Yom Tov because they were afraid that you won't bring it until Yom Tov. And once you wait until Yom Tov, we learned a little bit on the last daf, a topic that we'll learn again in the Rosh Hashanah daf Dalid. There is a violation of Bal Ta'acher. Don't delay bringing karbanos. We definitely don't like for people to wait until the last second, because if you wait until the last second and then an oinus happens, you won't end up bringing it. So by allowing people to bring the Nedarim and Nedavis on Yom Tov, a person during the year will say, why should I bring it now? I'm going to the Beis Hamikdash, I'll bring it then. There is a logic to say that midrabanan, don't bring it on Yom Tov, which will oblige people to come earlier to bring it. But don't learn pshat that way. I'll tell you that according to these opinions, afilo midoiraisa nami lichazi. Why? Where do we see that? Taha shtei halechem. The shtei halechem that has to bring on Shavuos, if you remember, you know when they would bake it? They would not bake it on Yom Tov. They would not even bake this on Yom Tov. They would bake it out of Yom Tov. Veleka lemigzar shemayasha. There's no b'chlal issue of you delaying it. You can only bring it on Yom Tov. You can't bring it earlier. Nevertheless, ve'enu doicha loisa Shabbos loisa Yom Tov. So what do we see over here? That malachos that are being violated for heavenly needs, even later it's going to be eaten. It may not be done. Wow. Okay. Says the Gemara. After this whole machlokes, and now that we have this version that holds that even Beis Hillel, Shlamim, even Shlamim, Nedarim and Nedavis may not be brought on Yom Tov. What happens if they made a mistake? Avar v'shachat. We're dafka shachat. And now there's the dam. Are you allowed to throw the dam? Or are you not allowed to throw the dam? So Rava says, yes, zoyrek es adam. Why this is key? Almanas lahatir basar ba'achila. No, it's the good thing is we want for you to eat it. If you will eat it after the fact, at least it was eaten. Oichel nefesh. And since you cannot eat it if you don't throw the dam, throw the dam. But the key is we want for you to be allowed to eat it, which implies if something happened to the meat, if all the meat was lost, you still have the emurim. If not, you can't throw the dam. If all the meat became tamei, according to Rava, you would not throw the dam. However, Rabba Barafuna says, the reason, I also agree that the dam should be thrown, but you know why Zoyrek es adam? In order for you to be able to bring the emurim, and you know what? You don't bring the emurim during the day. Again, we're going with the shitas that hold that nedarim and nedavis ain't craven b'yamtiv. But you know what? If the dam is sprinkled over carbon today, the hekter chalavim ve'evarim can be done the whole night. Midarabanan until midnight, but the whole night. Almanas like tiram la'erev. In other words, what's the ikir? Is the ikir to throw the dam for achila of the kohanim? Or is the ikir of throwing the dam in order to be makter de emurim? Achilas mizbeach, achilas kohanim. And again, just to quote in Chassidus, that achilas mizbeach is the ending of the avoid of birurim. That is viewed the ikir. Or adarabba, that kohanim oichlem ba'olam ischaprim, the concept of achila. And perhaps that's even said, perhaps on the achila of the balabas, that after we eat, after all of the emurim were burned, that's the concept of the avodah of yechudim, or the avodah of aliyahs, taking something that's already good from one level and bringing it into a higher level. Now, my benayu halacha lemaisa between Rava and Rabba Barafuna, ike benayu, what we mentioned. If before the zirikas adam the meat became tamei, or if the meat was lost, according to Rava, don't throw it. According to Rabba Barafuna, throw it, because like this you can bring the emurim at night. Meisvei, this will be a kasha against the shita of Rabba Barafuna. It says in a brayso, kifsei atzeres, that were slaughtered shaloi lishman. For example, they made a mistake, they slaughtered it l'shem oila. Guys, what's the first Mishnah in Zvachim? Kol hazvachim. Shenizbechu shaloi lishman. Ksherim, remember? Elo shaloi olo l'balam l'shem chayva. Chutz from Chatas and Pesach. The classical case. Zivchei, kifsei atzeres is the shalmei tzibur. Shlamim. If by mistake they offered it l'shem oila, or if they shechted it before the right time, erev Yom Tiv, or after the right time, says the Beitzah hadam yizarek. V'habasar yei ochel. Wow. Now, v'imois Shabbos. See, the problem is on Shabbos you can't eat the meat because you can't cook the meat. So then lo yizroik. Mama sounds like Rava. Since you can't eat it, don't throw the dam. However, if you threw the blood, daf chaf aleph, then churza, it's acceptable. Why? Because the zrikas adam had some effect. Al menas lahakter emurim la'erev. Since, in other words, burn the emurim at night. Burn them at night, but only throw it if you are able to eat it. So l'cha'ira imzarak means the yevedin lachatchil oloi, because it's Shabbos. So bishleim l'rava nicha, because since it's Shabbos and you can't make meat on Shabbos, and the zrikas adam is justified only for eating, you can't eat, you shouldn't do it. According to Rabba Barafuna, that you are able to be makter emurim at night, then why would it be only with the yeved? It should be lachatchila. So first of all, kasha. The iba yisema. That I would argue that since this Beitzah is speaking about Shabbos, for Shabbos we're more strict. We are more stringent on Shabbos, and even Rabba Barafuna that holds that for Yom Tiv, if you can be makter de emurim, you are lechatchila allowed to sprinkle the dam. On Shabbos it's only a b'diavad. Chavel will stop over here, and God willing, to be continued still in our sugya of karbanos and oichel nefesh.